In the autumn of 1347, a few merchant ships entered the harbor of Messina in Sicily. They had come from the Black Sea as part of the long trade route that linked Europe with Asia. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The ships carried grain, fabrics, and other goods that everyone expected. But when dockworkers climbed aboard, they found a sight that made no sense. Most of the crew were dead. The few still alive were covered in dark swellings, their skin blackened, their breath short and shallow. Within hours, the city understood that something terrible had arrived. Local authorities ordered the ships to leave immediately, but the infection was already on land. Rats had escaped from the holds, and with them came the fleas that carried the plague. Within days, sickness spread through the port. Families locked themselves inside their homes. Priests walked the streets reading prayers for the dying. Doctors tried everything they knew. They bled the sick, burned herbs, and filled the air with smoke, hoping it would drive the poison away. Nothing worked. The disease moved faster than anyone could react. People who seemed healthy in the morning were dead by nightfall. The illness followed the same pattern everywhere it appeared. Fever came first, then painful lumps under the arms and in the groin. Within a few days, the skin turned dark as blood vessels broke beneath it. Many victims vomited blood and died choking. The speed of death was unlike anything Europe had seen. In some homes, every member of the family was dead before neighbors realized they were ill. In others, whole streets fell silent within a week. There were too many bodies for the graveyards to hold. When people could no longer bury the dead, they began to burn them. By the end of that year, the plague had reached other ports. Ships from Messina sailed to Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. Everywhere they arrived, the same thing happened. The infection spread with a precision that terrified everyone who saw it. Within months, Italy was paralyzed. Markets were empty. Churches stood locked. The bells that once called people to prayer now tolled only for funerals. Records from the time say that people stopped looking each other in the eye because no one wanted to see death coming. The first wave of the plague was unstoppable. It reached France by the start of 1348 and then spread to Spain and the north. Everywhere it went, the same sequence followed: confusion, panic, and silence. People fled, but the plague traveled faster. It followed them through every road and every ship. Europe was still alive, but its heart was already failing. The greatest pandemic in recorded history had begun. By the start of 1349, the plague had already left the ports behind. It was moving inland, following every trade road and river that connected the continent. In France, it began in Marseille and reached Avignon within weeks. The Pope ordered huge fires to purify the air, but the smoke only mixed with the smell of death. The streets filled with carts carrying bodies. People burned their clothes, their bedding, even their homes, but nothing changed. In Paris, thousands died every week. Graveyards were full, and when there was no more room, people dug mass pits outside the walls. The same happened in Spain, in Germany, and across the Low Countries. No border could stop it. The plague did not care who you were. Kings, priests, and beggars all died the same way. Reports from Avignon tell of priests walking through the streets holding candles and chanting prayers for the dead, even as bodies lay piled outside the churches. In Florence, death came so quickly that families could no longer bury their relatives. One record says parents abandoned children and husbands left their wives because fear was stronger than love. The city's great merchants and artists locked their doors and fled into the countryside, but the plague followed them there too. In the villages, peasants died alone in the fields, and entire farms were left empty for years. Roads that once carried traders now carried only carts filled with the dead. The church tried to explain what was happening. Some said it was punishment from God. Others believed it came from the stars or from poison air. Groups of men called flagellants walked from town to town whipping themselves until their backs bled, believing that pain could earn forgiveness. They sang hymns and prayed in the open streets, and crowds gathered around them hoping to be spared. But when the plague reached their camps, they died like everyone else. Monks died in their monasteries. Priests died at the altars. When even the most faithful began to fall, people lost the last pieces of their belief. Fear turned into anger. In many towns, mobs attacked Jewish communities, accusing them of poisoning wells. Whole neighborhoods were burned, and thousands of innocent people were killed. Yet the plague kept moving. It did not follow guilt or innocence. It spread wherever people went. Cities closed their gates, and soldiers guarded the walls, refusing to let travelers in. In some towns, guards shot arrows at anyone who tried to enter. But the rats passed through cracks and under doors. The fleas needed no permission. Inside the locked homes, infection spread even faster. The more people hid, the quicker the disease found them. By mid-year, almost all of Central Europe was infected. Trade stopped, courts closed, and governments fell silent. Families broke apart. Parents abandoned their children, and children left their parents to die alone. The dead stayed in their beds for days before anyone dared to move them. In some places, neighbors used long hooks to drag the bodies into the streets. Fires burned day and night, filling the air with smoke and ash. People threw spices into the flames, hoping the scent would drive away the poison air. In Venice, the city leaders finally ordered ships to remain anchored for 40 days before unloading. It was the first official quarantine. The word itself, 40 giorni, meant 40 days, and it would survive long after the plague was gone. But the order came too late to save the city. Half its people were already dead. England saw the plague arrive that summer. It came through the southern ports of Dorset and spread inland. By autumn, it reached London. Witnesses wrote that so many people died there were not enough living to bury them. The city went silent. Only the creak of wheels and the cawing of crows broke the stillness. Houses stood empty. Food rotted in the markets. Even the dogs starved. In some parishes, 7 or 8 of every 10 residents were gone. The government tried to keep order, but the courts and parliament had stopped meeting. No one wanted to stand near another human being. Across Europe, the same scenes repeated: smoke, silence, and fear. Entire provinces disappeared from the records. Travelers later spoke of villages where grass had grown waist-high through the streets. Ships drifted empty at sea, their crews long dead and their sails torn by the wind. For a time, people thought the world was ending. And in a way, it was. By the end of 1349, half of Europe was gone. Trade routes were erased. Whole towns vanished. Faith itself had begun to crumble. Survival was all that remained, and death ruled everything else. By the year 1350, the plague had reached its peak. No part of Europe was untouched. From the coasts of Portugal to the fields of Poland, from the mountains of Switzerland to the cities of England, the same story repeated everywhere. People stopped counting the dead because numbers no longer meant anything. In many regions, entire generations vanished in less than a season. Villages were left without a single survivor. Churches stood open, their doors swinging in the wind, and no one came to pray. The sound of bells had become the sound of mourning, ringing day and night until there was no one left to ring them. In Paris, scholars tried to understand what had happened. They wrote reports for the king, claiming that the plague was caused by an unlucky alignment of planets. In England, the royal court fled London for the countryside, but servants carried the infection with them. In Florence, officials recorded that half the city had died. Those who survived walked through the streets covering their faces with cloths soaked in vinegar. Doctors began wearing long waxed robes and strange beaked masks filled with herbs, believing the smell would protect them from the poison air. Their appearance frightened people as much as the disease itself. They moved like shadows between the houses, marking doors with chalk and checking who was still alive. People began to call them plague doctors, but few of them survived for long. Even the healers were dying faster than they could help anyone. As the death toll grew, society began to fall apart. The rules of life, work, trade, marriage, and property no longer mattered. Laborers were gone, fields were empty, and harvests rotted where they stood. In some towns, the only people left were thieves and gravediggers. Gold lost its value because there was nothing left to buy. The plague had turned Europe into a place where death was the only constant. Yet life did not stop completely. In a few places, small groups of survivors tried to live among the ruins. They buried the dead, burned infected houses, and waited for the wind to change, hoping the disease would finally move on. In the countryside, wolves came closer to the villages. With no shepherds to guard the flocks, animals wandered freely through abandoned farms. In the cities, silence replaced every sound people once took for granted. The bells, the markets, the laughter, the music, all of it was gone. Records from the time said that people had forgotten how to speak above a whisper. The smell of death and smoke hung over everything. Even the rivers carried bodies downstream. In England, mass graves surrounded every town. In Germany, travel stopped completely. Roads became empty, and the great cathedrals that once showed human pride stood half-finished, surrounded by scaffolding no one would ever remove. Religion changed as well. Some believed the plague was a sign that the end of the world had begun. Processions of flagellants still moved from city to city, their chants echoing through the empty streets. Others began to dance, not in celebration but in madness. People gathered in groups, spinning and shouting until they collapsed from exhaustion. They called it the dance of death, a desperate attempt to prove that the living still existed among the dead. Artists later painted these scenes on the walls of churches, showing skeletons and peasants, nobles and kings, all holding hands in one endless circle. It became the image of an age that no one could forget. By the middle of the century, the first waves of the plague began to fade. It was not a victory, only exhaustion. The sickness had burned through what remained of Europe. In some regions, only 1 in 3 people was still alive. The survivors carried not only scars but memory. They had seen the collapse of everything that had once defined their world. When the fires went out and the smoke cleared, Europe understood that it had changed forever. By 1351, the first wave of the plague was slowing, but what remained was a continent on the edge of collapse. The survivors looked out at a world that no longer made sense. Fields lay empty because there were no farmers left to work them. Grain rotted in barns, and livestock wandered through the roads, unclaimed and untended. In France and Italy, wolves entered deserted villages. In England, entire parishes disappeared from the records. Roads that once carried merchants and pilgrims were silent. The few travelers who still moved between towns carried weapons and avoided strangers. Trade had stopped almost everywhere. Ships stayed anchored in harbors, their sails torn by months of neglect. Markets were closed, and money had lost its meaning. Famine followed the disease. People who had survived the plague now faced hunger. In the countryside, small groups of men formed bands to steal food from monasteries and estates. Nobles hid behind castle walls, but even they soon ran out of supplies. In many regions, law itself ceased to exist. Justice was decided by whoever had the strength to enforce it. The church, once the heart of medieval life, was broken. So many priests and monks had died that church services stopped entirely in many places. Those who survived were often too afraid to visit the sick or bury the dead. People turned to superstition, to charms and amulets, to anything that might promise protection. Some believed new cults that claimed to be chosen by God to rebuild the world. Others stopped praying at all. They had prayed through every night of the plague, and heaven had remained silent. Faith itself was infected by doubt. Governments tried to restore order, but there were too few people left to govern. The English crown sent new officials to the countryside and found that there was no one left to collect taxes. In Florence, records show that half the city's administrative offices were empty. Across Europe, kings issued decrees to control wages and prices, desperate to stop the chaos. But for the first time in memory, the workers had power. There were not enough of them to replace the dead, and they began to demand better pay and conditions. The feudal system that had ruled Europe for centuries was beginning to break apart, not through war, but through disease. Social order disintegrated. Families that had once lived by loyalty and obedience now fought over what remained. In some places, survivors refused to inherit the lands of their relatives, believing them to be cursed. In others, they fought violently over property. Cemeteries filled faster than records could be kept, and graves were often dug on top of older ones. The earth itself began to smell of decay. Travelers wrote of landscapes covered with broken crosses and overgrown fields where no human voice could be heard. By 1352, outbreaks continued in new towns, carried by refugees who had fled the famine. The disease had become a constant shadow, returning wherever the survivors gathered. The population of Europe was now less than half of what it had been 5 years earlier. Those who remained were haunted not only by what they had seen, but by what they had done to survive. The world they had known before 1347 was gone. What remained was a civilization without order, without faith, and without certainty that tomorrow would come. When the next wave of the plague appeared in 1353, people no longer screamed or prayed. They simply waited. Death had become part of life. Europe had entered a silence that was no longer fear, but exhaustion. What the disease had not destroyed, despair had. By the middle of the 14th century, the plague had finally begun to fade. It did not end suddenly. It simply ran out of victims. Towns that had once been filled with people were half empty. Villages had turned to grass and ruins. Travelers who passed through them found only silence and collapsed roofs. The great cities of Europe, from Florence to Paris to London, were smaller, darker, and quieter than they had ever been. Bells that once called people to prayer now rang only for funerals. The sound of daily life had vanished. Recovery was slow. It took years before markets reopened and fields were plowed again. Survivors were cautious. Many refused to return to the same houses where their families had died. In England, new laws were written to force people back to work, but they failed. With so few workers left, peasants realized that their labor finally had value. They began to demand pay, freedom, and respect, and the ruling classes had no choice but to listen. The plague had destroyed millions of lives, but it also broke the system that had kept them in place for centuries. In Italy, cities like Venice and Milan created the first public health offices to watch for signs of disease. Quarantine became a rule of policy. Ships were stopped in ports, and people were kept apart for 40 days before they could enter the city. The word quarantine came from those years of fear. Across Europe, governments began keeping written records of deaths, symptoms, and movements. For the first time, Europe tried to understand disease not as punishment, but as something that could be studied and prevented. Out of terror came the first steps toward science. The church struggled to regain its authority. People still went to Mass, but the unquestioned trust that had once existed was gone. During the plague, the silence of heaven had changed how people saw the world. Belief became personal. Painters began to show death not as judgment, but as part of life. The image of the dance of death spread through Europe. On church walls, skeletons held hands with nobles and peasants, kings and children, turning in endless circles. It was more than art. It was memory. Every survivor carried the same understanding: life was fragile, and death would never be far away again. Europe's population took more than a century to recover. Some regions lost entire languages and families that would never return. At the same time, land and wealth were redistributed among those who remained. A new social order began to grow. It was smaller, freer, and more mobile. The plague had destroyed the medieval world, but it cleared the ground for something new. Historians later said that without the Black Death, there might have been no Renaissance. Out of ruin came change. People began to value knowledge, medicine, and human life itself more than obedience and fear. By the end of the century, the memory of the plague was still everywhere. It lived in the writings, in the paintings, and in the graveyards that lined the roads. Even when peace returned, people spoke of time as before the plague and after the plague. It became the measure of an age. Centuries later, its lesson remained the same. A single invisible force had brought down kings and kingdoms, ended an era, and reshaped the course of human history.